The first time Adrian Sterling sat down on the ground in front of his own restaurant, nobody recognized him, and that was perhaps the most offensive and most useful part of the whole experiment. He wore an old jacket bought at a second-hand store, a fake beard, barely believable, under the shadow of a stained cap, and his hands hidden inside torn gloves, while the entrance of Sterling Table gleamed a few yards away, as if the entire city had been polished just to reflect itself in its windows. The night was humid, heavy, with that strange cold that sometimes settles over the city after a short rain, and the customers walked toward the golden door, taking care not to look at the human bundle sitting beside the wall. Adrian knew every inch of that place, the imported marble, the custom-made lamps, the exact scent the ventilation system released into the lobby to suggest luxury without smelling like perfume. He also knew the recent figures, which were far less elegant. Cancelled reservations, ferocious reviews on social media, a viral video in which a waiter had thrown out an elderly woman because her clothing disturbed the experience. That video had cost him more sleep than money, and in Adrian that was already a tragedy worthy of study. His brand director had proposed an emotional campaign. His lawyers had drafted a perfect apology, and the executive chef, Stephen Vance, had blamed the public's lack of visual education, a phrase so arrogant that Adrian nearly fired him out of pure spiritual hygiene. But instead of announcing changes from a boardroom table, he decided to do something no one on his team expected: disappear for one night under a ridiculous identity and see with his own eyes what kind of heart the house that carried his last name really had. During the first hour, the result was as clear as it was unpleasant. Two waiters walked past him, pretending to check their phones. A hostess asked the guard to move that thing before the critics arrived, and the dining room manager himself came out with a porcelain smile to tell him he couldn't stay there because he was affecting the restaurant's image. Adrian lowered his head, not out of fear, but because if he raised his eyes at that moment, perhaps the old habit of command would have destroyed the test before it was finished. The guard wasn't cruel, only obedient, which is sometimes a more comfortable form of cruelty. He told him to walk to the corner, that there was a church there where they sometimes gave out bread, and then he glanced nervously toward the door, as if he feared the marble was listening. Adrian obeyed a few steps, leaned his back against the side wall, and felt something strange. Not hunger yet, because he had eaten early in his penthouse from a plate designed by nutritionists, but a deeper discomfort. The discomfort of understanding that nobody was behaving differently because of his disguise. They were simply showing what they did when they believed no one important was watching. Behind the building, at the service entrance, the night was a different one. There were no French lamps or soft music there, but crates of vegetables, buckets, oil smoke, tired voices, and the metallic clatter of a kitchen that kept breathing even while the dining room pretended to float above the world. Adrian sat near the back door because from there he could hear better, and he heard Stephen raise his voice against someone. "Lucy, I already told you your soup is not going into tomorrow's tasting. This is not a family diner. This is fine dining. If you don't understand the difference, that's why you're still a prep cook." The woman didn't answer right away, and that silence interested him more than any defense would have. Adrian caught sight of her when she came out with a tray of herbs in her thin hand, her hair gathered under a net, her cheeks shining from the heat of the stoves, and a gaze that asked no one's permission to exist. She didn't look defeated, even though she had just been denied something important. She looked like a person who had learned to store her anger where it couldn't burn the innocent. When Stephen went back inside, she stood for a second under the yellow light of the doorway, and breathed, like someone counting to 10, so as not to hurl the tray against the wall. Adrian expected her to ignore him too, because that was the logic of the night, and because he, sitting there smelling of the street in borrowed clothes, had become a kind of silent examination for everyone. Lucy looked at him, but not with the quick discomfort of the customers or the administrative annoyance of the manager. She looked at him the way you look at a pot about to boil, with practical attention, without drama, and then she looked toward the kitchen to make sure no one was watching her. A few minutes later, she came back with a plastic container, wrapped in an old cloth, a disposable spoon, and an expression so serious, she almost seemed to be committing a misdemeanor. Here, but eat slowly because it's hot and I don't want to deal with one more burn victim from this kitchen," Lucy said in a low voice, crouching just enough so he wouldn't feel like a dog being tossed food. Adrian took the container without answering, perhaps because his throat had closed in an absurd way, and she added with a tired half-smile that it was nothing fancy, just blue corn soup with chicken, poblano chile, and epazote. The kind of thing that in that restaurant they called poor people's food, until somebody with an expensive last name put it on a white plate. The cloth wrapped around the container had a hand-embroidered letter, a slightly crooked blue R, and it was warm from the steam. Adrian noticed that detail before tasting the soup, because he had learned to notice luxury markings, the perfect embroidery on shirts, the initials engraved on crystal. But that humble R had something no boutique could counterfeit. When he finally brought the spoon to his mouth, the elegant world he had built over 15 years stood shamefully still behind him. It was not a complicated soup, and precisely for that reason, it was dangerous. The corn had a smoky sweetness. The broth was deep, without turning heavy. The epazote appeared at the end like a green memory, and the chile warmed without showing off. Adrian had paid fortunes for tasting menus that wanted to tell the story of an entire heritage with foams, tweezers, and names in French. But that woman, with leftovers defended in secret from an arrogant chef, had just placed in a plastic container something his brand had lost. Truth. Not an advertising truth, not a campaign truth, but the truth of a table where someone cooks so that someone else can survive the night. Lucy watched him take the first spoonful and seemed to relax slightly, as if she needed to confirm that he wasn't going to reject the only thing she could offer him. Then she sat for a moment on an empty crate, keeping a certain distance, and asked him if he had somewhere to sleep. Adrian could have lied easily, because lying in hard negotiations was almost a form of corporate breathing. But that question wasn't seeking information. It was seeking to care for him without invading him. So he only lowered his eyes and said he would manage that night, a phrase vague enough not to entirely dirty the moment. "Managing is not the same as being okay," she murmured, and then let out a small laugh without complete joy, as she remembered that her grandmother said the same thing every time Lucy pretended not to be tired. She told him, perhaps because talking to a stranger sitting in the shadows was easier than talking to the people who judged her under the light, that she had been in that kitchen for 3 years, that she had trained half the new staff, that she knew the base sauces better than some chefs in clean jackets, and that even so, that very afternoon, they had denied her the promotion again, because according to Stephen, her food smelled too much like home. Adrian listened without interrupting, the warm container between his hands and a guilt being born in an uncomfortable place. He had signed the expansion budgets, had approved the hiring of consultants, had demanded excellence from rooms where nobody smelled oil or cut their fingers dicing onions. But he didn't know the name of the woman holding up the kitchen from below. Nor did he know that his restaurant was refusing to promote a cook for having precisely what the brand was missing. The irony would have been funny if it didn't carry the bitter taste of a responsibility that was far too clear. From inside, someone shouted Lucy's name, and she rose with a quick motion, as if tenderness had limited hours before being punished. Before going in, she pointed at the cloth with the R and told him not to steal it, that it belonged to her grandmother Rose and had more history than all the pressed tablecloths in that place. Adrian promised to return it, and the word promise sounded strange in his mouth, because he was used to guaranteeing, signing, ordering, or buying, not promising something small to a woman who didn't know who he was. When the service door closed, Adrian was left alone with the noise of the kitchen on one side and the expensive murmur of the dining room out front. He took from his pocket a cheap phone his security team had prepared for the test, but he didn't call anyone. For the first time in a long time, he didn't want to solve the problem in 5 minutes or destroy a career with one dry order. He wanted to understand, and that desire irritated him as much as it moved him, because understanding was always slower than commanding. When he finished the soup, he folded the cloth with a delicacy that would have surprised any of his employees and looked at the back door through which Lucy had disappeared. Inside the restaurant, Stephen was preparing a menu tasting to save the reputation of Sterling Table, surrounded by expensive ingredients and speeches about culinary identity. Outside, in a plastic container, A prep cook nobody listened to had just handed him the answer, without asking anything in return. Adrian Sterling, the man who had gone to test his employees' humanity, understood with a silent shame that the real test had just begun for him. The next morning, Adrian Sterling discovered there were more uncomfortable ways of lying than sitting on the street in a torn jacket. The truly dangerous lie was not the one rehearsed in front of the mirror of the private bathroom of his office, with a fake beard, a stained cap, and worn shoes. The dangerous lie was the one that was starting to feel necessary. While his assistant summarized the day's agenda over the phone, he looked at the cloth embroidered with the R on his immaculate desk and thought that returning it in person was an absurd excuse, but also the only one he wanted to use. He canceled 2 meetings, postponed a call with investors, and left his team believing he would make a private inspection visit from some discreet vantage point, which was not entirely false, though it wasn't entirely honest either. He traded the Italian suit for a gray shirt, an old jacket, and jeans without a visible brand. Before leaving, he looked at his hands, far too well kept to belong to the man he was pretending to be. He rubbed a little dust over his knuckles with the solemn clumsiness of someone trying to buy a simple life for a few hours, without yet understanding that simplicity cannot be bought or performed without paying another price. When he arrived at the service entrance of Sterling Table, the restaurant was already awake on its less photogenic side. A truck was unloading crates of tomatoes, onions, poblano chiles, and fresh herbs. 2 helpers argued over an incomplete order list, and from inside came the thick steam of the morning stalks. Adrian stood by the wall with the folded cloth in his hand, feeling an irritating mixture of contained authority and shame, because that place carried his last name. But that morning he had no right to enter through any door without breaking the small thread of truth that Lucy had handed him with a soup. Lucy appeared carrying a crate of cilantro on her hip, her hair messier than the night before, and a smudge of flour on her cheek. When she saw him, she didn't shout, didn't call the guard, didn't make that gesture of quick pity he had observed so much in others. She only raised an eyebrow and said that if he was coming to return the cloth, he was arriving just in time to earn his breakfast, because a man who shows up 2 days in a row at a kitchen door is no longer a mystery. He's a logistical responsibility. Adrian almost smiled, and that almost was more sincere than many of his gala smiles. He held out the cloth like someone returning a delicate document, and Lucy inspected it with the same seriousness a bank would inspect a diamond. "It's clean. That already speaks better of you than of several cooks with contracts," she murmured. And before he could decide whether he should leave or stay, a crate of tomatoes slipped from the truck and split open against the ground. Lucy let out a good old-fashioned American curse, the kind grandmothers forgive only if there's a genuine emergency, and pointed at the remaining crates. If he really wanted to help, he could start by carrying without playing the abandoned poet. Adrian had lifted contracts, companies, other people's debts, and entire crises, but a wet crate of tomatoes turned out to hold a more concrete humiliation. He grabbed it by the wrong sides, nearly lost his balance, and almost crushed a bag of lemons while Lucy watched him with a mixture of alarm and amusement. "You've never carried even a properly balanced guilt in your life, have you?" she said, and he answered that he learned fast, though inside he had to admit he couldn't remember the last time anyone had mocked him without fear of losing their job. It was in the middle of that small battle with the vegetables that a skinny teenager appeared with a bag of bread rolls under his arm and a school backpack hanging from one shoulder. He had Lucy's alert eyes and the insolent confidence of someone the world hasn't entirely crushed yet. "Lou, is this the soup guy?" Tommy asked, looking Adrian up and down, and then added that he carried tomatoes like he was negotiating with them, not moving them. Lucy gave him a little swat on the back of the neck with the cloth, but a laugh escaped her that made the alley seem less gray. Adrian introduced himself without thinking too much, because his real name burned on his tongue and the silence was starting to draw too much attention. He said his name was Matthew, that he had worked in kitchens here and there, and that lately things hadn't gone well for him. The sentence fell among the 3 of them with a dangerous simplicity. Lucy didn't ask for last names, maybe out of politeness, or maybe because she understood that certain wounds arrive without documents. But Tommy looked at him with youthful suspicion and declared that any adult who said things didn't go well was hiding at least 3 disasters and 1 debt. Lucy sent her brother off to deliver the bread before he was late for school, though she slipped into his backpack a small container of beans and rice, wrapped with that speed of women who feed while they scold. Tommy protested that he wasn't a child anymore, but accepted the food with the dignity of someone who knows that arguing with a tired sister is a high-risk sport. Adrian watched the scene in silence, surprised by the naturalness with which that family held itself up through small gestures, without speeches, without bank transfers, without anyone announcing sacrifices as if they were press releases. Inside the kitchen, Stephen appeared in his impeccable white jacket and with a look that soiled more than any used apron. He asked what that man was doing at the service entrance, and Lucy answered that he was helping unload because the warehouse manager hadn't arrived. The chef looked at her as if she had confessed a class crime and said Sterling Table was not a soup kitchen, that they had already suffered enough embarrassment with the viral video without filling the back door with sad stories. Adrian felt the old impulse to reveal himself rise through his chest with an almost elegant violence, but he clenched his teeth and kept silent. What cost him most was not tolerating the insult, but hearing Lucy swallow it without lowering her head. She didn't ask permission to exist, but neither did she spend energy giving Stephen the spectacle of seeing her wounded. She only said the crates were already inside, that the mise en place wasn't going to do itself, and that if the chef wanted perfect tomatoes for his rescue menu, someone had to make sure they didn't end up burst on the ground. The answer was so calm that Stephen couldn't find anywhere to strike her without looking smaller than he already was. Later, when the activity slowed a little, Lucy handed Adrian a cup of spiced pot coffee in a disposable cup and a piece of bread roll with butter. She told him not to get excited, because she wasn't hiring him or adopting him, just keeping him from fainting on top of the crates and giving her more work. Adrian accepted the breakfast as if receiving something undeserved, and maybe it was. From the alley, he heard 2 employees talking about the crisis meeting with the executives, about the red numbers at the Beverly Hills location, and about the pressure from investors. Without meaning to, he corrected a figure under his breath. Lucy heard him. She said nothing at first, but her eyes changed slightly, as if a small needle had found new fabric to pin itself into. Adrian tried to cover the mistake by drinking coffee, but the coffee was hotter than expected, and his flinch betrayed him with a ridiculous humanity. She looked at him sideways and asked in a casual tone where he had learned so much about operating margins for someone who, according to him, came from kitchens here and there. Adrian held the cup between his hands and answered that you hear things when you work in restaurants, that owners talk too much when they think the people below don't understand. The answer was good, almost perfect, and precisely for that reason, it left a bad taste in his mouth. Lucy seemed to accept it, though not entirely. She stored it in the same place where intelligent women keep details that aren't useful yet, but might someday explain a complete lie. To change the subject, he asked her about the soup from the night before, about the blue corn and the epazote, and then Lucy's face softened in a way no brand strategy could have achieved. She told him it was her grandmother Rose's recipe, born in a kitchen where salt was measured with the fingers and sadness with the size of the pot. That conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but Adrian came out of it with more useful information than from 3 gastronomic consultancies, and with an unease that appeared in no report. Lucy talked about food the way others talk about home, not as product, not as trend, not as content for social media. She said a dish could be humble without asking forgiveness, that elegance wasn't hiding the origin but honoring it, and that if someone needed to put foam on a memory in order to respect it, maybe they didn't have memory, only budget. Adrian listened to her and understood why Stephen feared her more than he despised her. Before going back into the kitchen, Lucy pulled a scrap of paper from her pocket and wrote down a number with a chewed pencil. She gave it to him without ceremony, clarifying that it was not a romantic invitation, nor a promise of employment, nor an emergency line for mysterious men, but the contact for a parish where they sometimes needed helpers to serve food. Adrian took the paper, and the simple gesture pierced his chest with an unexpected guilt, because she was offering him a real way out of an invented misfortune. "Thank you, Lucy," he said, And for a second, pronouncing her name without titles or distance felt more intimate to him than any kiss. She went back into the restaurant, and Adrian stood under the pale morning light with the folded paper between his fingers. He could end the experiment right there and fire Stephen, promote Lucy, buy the grandmother a house, and convince himself he had repaired the damage with the comfortable speed of money. But something in him, something less efficient and more human, didn't want to close the story so soon. He put the number in his pocket and knew he was doing exactly what he never tolerated in others, complicating a simple problem over an emotion he didn't know how to control. The first dinner invitation didn't arrive with music or candles or that kind of elegant tension Adrian had seen in restaurants where couples looked at each other as if love could also be reserved with a platinum card. It arrived at 8:30 at night, when Lucy came out through the service door, with her shoulders sunk from a double shift, and found him waiting near the alley, not like a lost customer, nor like a man who knew how to explain why he kept returning, but like someone who had discovered a light left on, and couldn't find the courage to walk away from it. She looked him up and down, with a grocery bag in one hand and her exhaustion in the other, and said that if he was going to keep appearing like the patron saint of badly combed mysteries, he could at least carry something useful. Adrian took the heavier bag too quickly, as if that gesture could redeem him from something he still didn't know how to name, and Lucy pursed her lips when she noticed the way he held it, too careful, too tense, as if he had never walked several blocks with tomatoes, rice, tortillas, and a bottle of cheap oil banging against his leg. The neighborhood night market had nothing of the silent precision of his gourmet suppliers. There were stalls closing up, music coming from a tired speaker, vendors selling off ripe avocados, and women who knew Lucy by name, by her outstanding tab, and by the exact size of her patience. Adrian tried to choose poblano chiles like someone evaluating investments, separating each piece with an almost offensive concentration, until Lucy took the bag from his hand and explained that in a family kitchen, the winner wasn't the one who bought the most perfect thing, but the one who knew how to choose enough so it would last through tomorrow too. You shop as if you're afraid the world will run out on you if you don't take the best, she said. And though the sentence carried a smile, Adrian felt the soft blow of an unexpected truth. He answered that he preferred to prevent mistakes, but Lucy replied that sometimes preventing everything was another way of living nothing, and kept walking before seeing what face he made. Adrian stayed a second behind with a bag of onions in his hand and the absurd sensation that a woman counting coins in front of a stall had just understood him better than several discreet therapists recommended by millionaire friends. The building where Lucy lived had a narrow staircase, walls painted a tired green, and a smell of detergent, broth, and rain stored in damp clothes. On the second floor, a blue door opened before they knocked, and Tommy appeared with a pencil behind his ear, looking at Adrian as if he had been waiting to interrogate him since morning. Behind him, the voice of an older woman asked whether Lucy was bringing the cilantro, or whether she intended to feed the family on good intentions, because good intentions made you hungry within 15 minutes if they didn't come with tortillas. Rose Harper was sitting by the table with a shawl over her shoulders, fingers twisted by age, and eyes that didn't need to move much to see everything. Adrian greeted her with a courtesy that came out too polished, almost boardroom-like, and the grandmother observed him like someone tasting a broth without a spoon. "This one's not from around here," she said at last, without cruelty, and Lucy answered that nobody was from anywhere when they were hungry. Rose accepted that explanation halfway, which was more than Adrian deserved, and pointed him to a chair with the calm authority of a queen in a 3-room kingdom. The dinner had no menu, and maybe that's why it was the first meal in years Adrian couldn't anticipate. There was red rice, thick beans, squash with cheese, tortillas warmed directly on the griddle, and a little shredded chicken that Lucy distributed with mathematical justice, reserving the best parts for Rose and Tommy without either being able to accuse her of sacrifice. Adrian noticed the gesture because his life had been built on distributions of power. But there the economy was more delicate. Nobody said, "I'm giving you mine." They just nudged a little more food toward the beloved plate and pretended it was chance. Tommy didn't take long to attack. He asked Matthew which kitchens he had worked in, why he didn't have family nearby, whether he knew how to make eggs without burning them, and why a man who claimed to have slept on the street had hands like a lotion commercial. Lucy nearly choked on her water. Rose let out a low laugh, and Adrian looked at his own fingers as if they had just given away a crime. He answered that he had done less rough work before, that life changed, and that not all blows leave visible calluses. A reasonable sentence that Tommy accepted only because the beans were too good to keep investigating on a busy stomach. After dinner, Adrian stood up to help wash the dishes, and the entire kitchen seemed to hold its breath. Not because a man washing dishes was a miracle, but because he approached the sink with the solemnity of someone about to defuse a bomb. Lucy handed him the sponge and told him the hot water opened to the left. But Adrian turned the wrong handle, got a jet of cold water on his sleeve, and maintained a dignity so rigid that Tommy declared from the table that Matthew washed dishes like a repentant soap opera villain. Even Adrian laughed, a little at first, then with a surprise that opened something inside his chest. Rose observed him for a long while as Lucy stored leftovers in small containers and Tommy pretended to do homework. The old woman didn't ask him who he was, but she spoke to him as if she already knew that some people arrive with borrowed names because they can't bear their own. She told him the blue corn soup had been born in a bad season, when her mother made one chicken stretch for 3 days, and said the epazote served to remind you that even humble things could perfume a house. Lucy lowered her gaze when she heard her, and Adrian understood that recipe was not a culinary whim but a genealogy of resistance served hot. Later, Tommy spread out his math notebook and announced that he hated percentages with a clean passion, without nuance. Adrian sat down beside him on impulse and began explaining costs, discounts, and profits, using ingredient examples, calculating how much was lost if a supplier raised the price of corn, or if a kitchen wasted a crate of tomatoes. He spoke so naturally about margins, inventories, and negotiation that Lucy stopped drying a plate mid-motion. He realized, too late, the way one always arrives late to the emotional consequences of a well-built lie. For someone who only passed through kitchens here and there, you know a lot about big numbers, she said without accusing him. And that absence of accusation hurt him more than open suspicion. Adrian looked at Tommy's notebook, where the percentages looked like small innocent traps, and answered that he had listened to many owners argue in front of invisible employees. It was the second time he used that explanation, and repeating it, it sounded less like a defense and more like a twisted confession. Lucy nodded, but she didn't smile the same way for a few minutes, and Adrian felt that the warmth of the kitchen didn't disappear. It only stepped one pace away. The night tried to reassemble itself when Tommy showed him a drawing for a school assignment. He had drawn Lucy with an enormous pink chef's hat, sitting next to a pot, and himself holding a spoon like a sword. In one corner, with quick strokes, he had added Matthew carrying tomatoes with a face of professional suffering. Lucy made fun of the nose her brother had given her. Rose said the drawing needed more tortillas to look real, and Adrian stored the image in his memory with a force that embarrassed him, because no one had included him in a family scene in so many years that he had almost forgotten what it felt like not to be a visitor in someone's life. When it was time to leave, Lucy walked him to the blue door, with the cloth with the R between her hands. She didn't give it to him, but she held it, as if the fabric remembered things she still didn't want to say. She thanked him for helping with Tommy, though she made clear he shouldn't get used to free dinners, because in that house, hospitality was generous, but not stupid. Adrian answered that he could bring something next time, and she looked at him with a mixture of mockery and warning, before telling him nothing expensive, nothing weird, and nothing that required a dictionary to be eaten. On the staircase, he heard the voices of the house, closing behind the door. Tommy complaining about percentages, Rose asking them not to leave the beans out, and Lucy laughing softly, maybe from exhaustion, or maybe because the night had been a little less hard. Adrian went down slowly, with the smell of warm tortillas clinging to his clothes, and a new sadness working its way between his ribs. He had entered that house as Matthew, a man invented to investigate other people's truth, but he left, wishing he were someone capable of deserving a chair at that table, without a disguise, without calculation, and without the cruel power of disappearing when the lie stopped being convenient. Happiness, when it arrived in Adrian Sterling's life, didn't take the scandalous shape he would have imagined in another era. It didn't arrive with a signed contract, or a flattering magazine cover, or the cold relief of watching the restaurant's reservations climb after a well-managed crisis. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the form of a message from Lucy, saying that Tommy had passed percentages without insulting mathematics, and that if Matthew wanted to brag about being a teacher, he could come by the house and eat some quesadillas before Grandma Rose decided that useful men were an endangered species. Adrian read that message inside his car, parked 2 blocks from a meeting with investors, and smiled in such an involuntary way that his driver, from the mirror, pretended not to see it out of an instinct for job survival. For years, his messages had been figures, urgencies, approvals, threats disguised as cordiality, and hollow congratulations from people who never called him without a hidden interest. Now, a woman who didn't know his real last name was writing to tell him about her brother's school victory, and that simplicity made him feel a belonging that his penthouse, with its perfect windows and expensive silences, had never known how to offer. But while Matthew learned to sit at the Harpers' table without taking up too much space, Adrian kept existing elsewhere, in a dark suit, with a measured voice and a last name that opened doors before he knocked. That morning, at the corporate headquarters of Sterling Table, he received a report from the creative team about the menu they were to present at the brand rescue event. Among photos of minimalist dishes and phrases like reinterpreted rural memory, a description appeared that froze his blood with an almost culinary precision. Cream of blue corn, with essence of epazote, poblano chile foam, and chicken confit, inspired by folk flavors. He didn't need to ask where the inspiration had come from, because at the bottom of the document stood the name of Stephen Vance as the person responsible for the proposal. Adrian read the page twice, not out of doubt, but out of contained rage, and remembered Lucy at the service door, saying her soup was poor people's food, until somebody with an expensive last name put it on a white plate. There it was, the white plate, the elegant appropriation, someone else's memory converted into product, and he, the owner of the whole structure that allowed that theft, felt that his silence was beginning to look too much like complicity. He could intervene immediately from his authority, but doing so without revealing how he knew the story would lead him into a web of clumsy explanations, and revealing the truth meant losing Lucy before he was ready to ask forgiveness. That cowardice humiliated him more than any business failure. He called his legal director, asked to review the internal policies on culinary authorship, and ordered that no dish at the event be presented without complete traceability of origin, though he didn't mention Lucy's name. Then he hung up and stood looking at the city from the boardroom, understanding that sometimes powerful men call themselves prudent when in reality they are frightened. That night, arriving at Lucy's home in the rain, he found her in the small kitchen, with her sleeves rolled up and eyes full of a quiet fury. Stephen had asked her to prepare bases for a menu tasting without explaining anything, and a co-worker had whispered to her that the chef was selling a refined version of her soup as the restaurant's great salvation. Lucy wasn't crying. She measured the corn with a fierce concentration, as if every kernel deserved a testimony. When Adrian asked if she was okay, she let out a dry laugh and said she was perfectly fine, except for the detail that her family recipe was being stolen with silverware. Rose, sitting by the window with her shawl, didn't raise her voice, but her silence weighed more than any shout. She said a recipe was not just ingredients, that it was also the hand that learned it, the pot where it survived, and the person who decided to share it without selling their soul. Tommy, pretending to do homework at the table, added that whoever stole his grandmother's soup deserved to eat boiled broccoli, without salt, for the rest of his life. A sentence so specific that Lucy ended up laughing despite her anger. Adrian laughed too, but guilt closed his throat before he finished. Lucy decided to cook the soup from scratch, not for the restaurant, but to remember how it was supposed to taste before they dressed it up. Adrian helped her under the implacable supervision of Rose, who corrected from her chair like a general of ancient pots. He learned to toast the corn until the aroma filled the kitchen with a smoky sweetness, to roast the chiles until the skin blistered, to shred the chicken without destroying it, and not to measure salt with fear. Each of Lucy's instructions was simple, but carried behind it an authority that needed no uniform. There, in that kitchen, she was the chef, and he was barely an apprentice with too many secrets. The rain tapped the window with a soft insistence, and the yellow light made the steam glow over their faces. At one point, Adrian made a mistake grinding the corn and left a texture too fine, almost like an expensive restaurant's. Lucy came close, put her hand over his to stop him, and explained that he shouldn't erase the coarseness completely, because a home soup had to let you feel where it came from. The closeness lasted barely a few seconds, but in those seconds, Adrian's world shrank to the warmth of her fingers, the smell of ipazote, and the discreet sound of his own breathing betraying him. She noticed a smudge of dough on his wrist and wiped it away with the edge of the cloth embroidered with the R. The gesture was minimal, domestic, almost unintentional, but it went through Adrian with a tenderness he didn't know how to manage. Lucy raised her eyes, and for an instant there was no chef or prep cook, no invented beggar, no hidden owner. Only two people too tired to keep pretending they weren't looking for each other in every pause. Rose cleared her throat from the table with admirable theatrical timing, and said the soup was going to get jealous if they kept looking at each other like teenagers in aprons. So they separated with a clumsiness that made Tommy hide his laughter behind his notebook. Afterwards, the four of them had dinner, and the soup tasted like something Adrian would have wanted to bottle and protect from all of his own companies. Lucy ate a little worried, turning her spoon while she explained that she didn't mind her recipe traveling far, as long as it traveled with her name and Rose's, not disguised as the brainstorm of a man who had never peeled a chile without an assistant. Adrian was on the verge of saying everything right there. The sentence formed complete in his mouth. Lucy, I am Adrian Sterling. But Tommy asked whether Matthew could go to the presentation event as the family spy, and the opportunity broke apart in nervous laughter. The gravest mistake came at the end of the night. Rose asked his opinion about what Lucy could do if the restaurant used the recipe without permission, and Adrian answered too quickly, in terms too precise. He spoke of copyright applied to culinary compilations, of confidentiality contracts, of moral recognition, of abusive labor clauses, and of how a company had to document the origin of a creation before presenting it to the media. When he finished, the kitchen went strangely still. Lucy was looking at him with a new attention, and Tommy slowly lowered his pencil, as if he had just witnessed a ghost solving algebra. For someone who sleeps where he can, and works when they let him, you know too much about corporate lawyers, Lucy said, without raising her voice. Adrian felt all the exits closing at the same time. He could have confessed, could have chosen the clean wound before the lie grew larger, but he did what intelligent cowards do while they still believe themselves prudent. He offered a half-truth. He said that years ago he had worked near important people, that he listened, that he learned fast, that not everyone who falls comes from the bottom. Lucy held his gaze a few seconds longer than was bearable, and then nodded. Though this time the nod wasn't trust, but a door not yet closing, only because she didn't want to push it. Leaving the building, Adrian didn't call for a car at the usual corner. He walked several blocks in the rain, with the smell of the soup on his clothes, and the unbearable weight of having had the truth on his tongue, and having put it back in his pocket. His real phone vibrated with messages from the team. Stephen wanted to approve the final version of the dish for the event. The media had confirmed attendance. The investors expected a strong signal of renewal. Adrian answered only one thing, that no recipe would be presented without his personal review, and put the device away with a rage he didn't know whether to direct at the chef, the system, or himself. When he arrived at the penthouse, the spaciousness seemed indecent to him. The designer kitchen was clean as a museum, without steam, without laughter, without a grandmother correcting the salt from a chair, without a teenager condemning soup thieves to eternal broccoli. Adrian took off his wet jacket and found in the pocket a small kernel of toasted corn that had been trapped in the fabric. He held it between his fingers as if it were courtroom evidence, and understood, too late to sleep in peace, that every day he kept being Matthew made it harder for Lucy ever to forgive Adrian. Lucy Harper arrived at the presentation event in the cleanest uniform she owned, with the cloth embroidered with the R folded inside the inner pocket of her jacket. right where it could neither be stained nor lost. She wasn't invited as a chef, of course, but as kitchen support, an efficient shadow among trays, tongs, and last-minute orders. Even so, as she climbed through the service entrance of the main hall, she allowed herself a small and dangerous hope. Maybe that night, someone would taste the true soup. Maybe Stephen couldn't hide everything. Maybe Matthew would be waiting for her afterward so they could laugh together at the dishes with names that were too long. The dining hall of Sterling Table had been transformed into a theater of carefully calculated elegance. There was press, investors, food critics, white flowers on black tables, and an enormous screen where images of blue corn, hard-working hands, and fields at dawn kept repeating, as if the memory of humble people needed golden filters to become acceptable. Lucy observed the porcelain bowls lined up at the main station and felt a strange knot when she recognized the color of the soup. Paler, silkier, more obedient, as if someone had combed a wild girl's hair to present her to wealthy strangers. Stephen walked among the cooks with a confidence too big for him, correcting plate angles and repeating that this cream was the emotional heart of the new menu. When he saw Lucy, he ordered her to check garnishes without really looking at her, the way you look at a useful tool that shouldn't be allowed to talk. She obeyed because she needed the job, because Rose had medicines to buy, and because Tommy still believed adults could win battles by following the rules. But her fingers pressed against the pocket where her grandmother's cloth was, and that pressure reminded her that a person can be silent without being defeated. At 9 o'clock sharp, the lights lowered and the murmur of the hall took on that reverent tone with which rich people usually receive men who own things. A presenter spoke of crisis, renewal, and a return to roots. Words so polished that Lucy almost didn't recognize them as belonging to the same world where her grandmother toasted corn in an old skillet. Then he announced the founder and owner of the group, the man whose vision, he said, had turned Sterling Table into a benchmark of contemporary American cuisine. Lucy went on arranging spoons without real interest until she heard the last name. Adrian Sterling appeared on the screen before appearing on the stage. The image showed him descending a side staircase in a perfect black suit, hair combed back, jaw firm, and a calm that did not belong to the man who burned his fingers washing dishes. At first, Lucy's mind did something merciful and refused to understand. She saw a resemblance, a coincidence, a cruelty of the light. But then he raised his gaze toward the audience, and there were the same eyes that had listened to her talk about hunger, stolen recipes, small houses, and dignity. The hall applauded. The executives leaned toward him with obedient smiles. Stephen straightened his back with fear disguised as respect, and someone near the kitchen station murmured, "Mr. Sterling is ready to taste the dish." Lucy felt the air become too thin. Matthew didn't exist. The man who had carried tomatoes, who had eaten dinner at her table, who had let Tommy draw him with a face of professional suffering, was the owner of the restaurant that denied her the promotion and allowed her recipe to be presented under another name. She didn't cry. It would have been easier to cry, perhaps more understandable for anyone looking for a scene. But Lucy stood still with a tray between her hands, watching all the pieces find their place with cruel precision. The phone that was too good, the well-kept hands, the legal terms spoken without effort, the way he corrected operating figures, the half-answers, the chosen silences, everything she had decided not to look at, out of respect for someone else's wound, rose up before her, like a table set with her own naivety. Adrian began to speak from the stage, and his voice filled the hall with that low authority Lucy had heard in the small kitchen when he explained percentages to Tommy. He spoke of recovering the essence, of honoring the invisible hands, of looking inward before asking the public for forgiveness. Every sentence could have been beautiful, if it hadn't arrived too late and from a lie that was too large. When his eyes found Lucy at the back of the hall, the next word cracked just slightly, so little that maybe nobody else noticed, but she did. And that small break was the final confirmation. Stephen took advantage of the pause to approach the auxiliary microphone and present the dish as a creation of the culinary research team, inspired by folk flavors and elevated by contemporary technique. Lucy set the tray on the table with excessive care, because if she let it drop, Perhaps the sound would reveal everything her throat was holding back. Adrian turned his head toward Stephen, and in his face appeared a hardness that could have saved something if it had arrived earlier. But at that moment, for Lucy, it no longer mattered who stopped the theft. What mattered was who had let her love an invented stranger. Adrian came down from the stage earlier than planned, crossing the hall amid murmurs, and approached the kitchen station with the contained desperation of a man used to pushing his way through without asking permission. "Lucy," he said in a low voice. And it was strange to hear her name in that official mouth, surrounded by cameras, suits, glasses, and people who suddenly pretended not to be listening. She looked at him with a calm, so pale that he seemed to stop a little before reaching her. There were no screams in her eyes. There was something worse, a door closing from the inside without making a sound. "So Matthew was the name you used when you wanted people to treat you like a human being," Lucy said, and each word fell clean, without ornament, without scandal, low enough not to feed the press, and clear enough that he couldn't take refuge in misunderstandings. Adrian opened his mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to ask for a minute, maybe to say it had all started as an investigation. She raised a hand, not to touch him but to stop him, and added that the problem had never been his money, or his last name, or even the restaurant. The problem was that he had known everything about her, while she knew nothing true about him. The silence between them was louder than the hall's applause. Lucy took the cloth embroidered with the R from her pocket, held it a moment between her fingers, and looked at the crooked letter her grandmother had sewn years ago, with the patience of a poor and proud woman. That cloth had wrapped the first bowl she gave to a hungry man, and now it seemed like evidence for the prosecution against the part of her that had wanted to believe. She left it on the service table, next to the porcelain bowls where her family's soup had been dressed up for others, and the gesture made Adrian go paler than any insult would have. "Give it to someone who knows how to return things before using them," she said, and then took off her kitchen cap with a dignity that needed no witnesses. Stephen tried to say her name, perhaps fearing a scene, perhaps fearing to lose control of the dish, but Adrian silenced him with a look that arrived too late to seem like justice. Lucy walked past them both without running, without looking back. She crossed the service corridor and went out into the night, through the same door where, days earlier, she had given a hot soup to a stranger, who was not a stranger, but a powerful man playing at not being one. Adrian followed her to the street, but didn't dare touch her. He said her name again with a voice that no longer commanded, and Lucy stopped, only because she still had the manners not to leave a wound talking to itself. The rain was beginning to fall slowly, drawing dark spots on the pavement. She told him not to come to her house that night, not to call Tommy, not to try to explain to Rose with pretty words something he had done with crooked acts. Then she added, lower, that some lies don't hurt because they hide wealth, but because they turn another person's trust into a place to hide. When Lucy walked away, Adrian didn't ask anyone to stop her, didn't call his driver, didn't use the power he had so often confused with a solution. He stood in the rain in front of his own restaurant, while the guards looked at him, without knowing whether they should protect him from the night or from himself. Back inside the hall, he announced in front of everyone that the dish would not be presented, that Stephen was suspended pending a formal investigation, and that the recipe belonged to Lucy Harper and Rose Harper. Though the public recognition repaired nothing in the exact place where the important thing had broken. Later, in the penthouse, the city glowed behind the glass like a cold model, obedient and mute. Adrian left the cloth embroidered with the R on the marble counter of a kitchen that had never smelled of epazote, and for the first time he understood that his home was enormous, because nobody stayed in it. He called Lucy once, then again, and got no answer. He wrote a message, deleted it, wrote another, deleted that one too, because every explanation sounded like an excuse when placed next to a cloth returned too late. The morning after losing Lucy, Adrian Sterling did something that bewildered everyone who worked for him. He didn't give an order to bring her back. He didn't ask security to find out where she was. He sent no flowers, sent no car to the door of her building, and called no journalist to turn his remorse into a touching story. He sat in the boardroom with the cloth embroidered with the R folded in front of him, and listened for 20 minutes to his executives talk about damage control until he understood that that phrase, damage control, was precisely the language in which he had learned to destroy what was most human. When he finally spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He said Stephen Vance was out of the company, not for media convenience, but for having tried to appropriate someone else's recipe and for sustaining a kitchen culture where the people at the bottom were invisible until they served to decorate a speech. He ordered a review of every promotion denied in the past 3 years, the creation of clear culinary authorship contracts, the payment of overdue overtime, and the opening of an internal program so that prep cooks and line cooks could present dishes with full credit. Nobody applauded, because it wasn't a pretty announcement. It was an uncomfortable reparation, the kind that costs money, pride, and habits. His brand director tried to suggest that Lucy appear in a campaign under the concept of the cook who saved the soul of Sterling Table, and Adrian felt a calm, precise nausea. He answered that Lucy's name would not be used without her permission, that her story was not the company's emotional material, and that if she decided never to set foot in the restaurant again, the company would respect that decision, even if the public wanted a more photogenic reconciliation. In another time, Adrian would have considered that stance a strategic weakness. Now it seemed to him barely the first decent gesture of a man who had confused attention with the right to enter someone's life. For 3 days, Lucy didn't respond. Adrian stopped calling after the first attempt, because he finally understood that respecting a closed door was also a way of asking forgiveness. Instead of insisting, he went to the parish whose number she had given him, back when she still believed Matthew needed help. There he served food without cameras, without a suit, without announcing donations, and made mistakes as simple as overfilling the plates or not knowing where the clean spoons were kept. The woman in charge of the dining hall told him he had the face of a man punished by his own conscience, and Adrian accepted the description with a humility that still fit him tightly. On the 4th day, Tommy appeared at the entrance of the dining hall with his backpack hanging, and a look that carried not childhood but a courtroom. He didn't greet him right away. He approached the table where Adrian was drying trays and asked him whether it was true that millionaires also washed dishes when nobody was filming them. Adrian set the tray on the table, crouched slightly so as not to speak to him from above, and answered that some learned late, but they could learn. Tommy looked at him a long time and said Lucy didn't want to see him, that Rose said people should listen to the silence they caused, and that he personally was still offended at having drawn a liar in his family assignment. That small blow hurt more than many adult insults. Adrian told him he was right, that he had lied, and that the drawing was not Tommy's fault, because a child should not be ashamed for having trusted. He promised him no gifts, no scholarships, no brilliant solutions. He only asked that when Lucy was ready to listen, he tell her that he didn't want to force his way in, only to return something and ask forgiveness in front of the people he had also hurt. Tommy crossed his arms with the seriousness of a 15-year-old judge and answered that he would deliver the message, but that this didn't mean absolution, because he had learned percentages and now knew how to calculate emotional debts. That very night, Adrian received a message from an unknown number. It was brief, so sober that he seemed to hear Rose's voice behind every word. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. No driver in front of the building. No flowers, no press, no long speeches. Adrian read the message several times, not because he didn't understand it, but because, for the first time, a simple instruction made him more nervous than $1 million negotiation. The next day he left the car far away, walked to the blue door with a bag of ordinary sweetbread, not from an elegant bakery, and the cloth with the R folded between his hands, as if he were carrying a living thing. Lucy opened the door. She wasn't wearing a uniform, but a simple blouse and her hair tied back carelessly. But to Adrian, she seemed more imposing than anyone he had ever seen on a red carpet. Behind her, Rose was stirring something in the kitchen, and Tommy pretended to study with the exaggerated concentration of someone listening to every breath. Adrian didn't try to smile. He said, "Good evening." He entered when Lucy stepped aside and stood in the middle of that small living room where he had once wanted to belong, without having paid the price of the truth. He didn't begin with, "I only wanted," or "It was all a misunderstanding." because he had spent enough nights listening to his own excuses until he hated them. He turned first to Rose and told her he had entered her home as a false man who had eaten from her table and learned from her recipe without deserving that trust. Then he looked at Tommy and asked his forgiveness for having accepted a place in his drawing when he still hadn't dared to present himself with his whole face. Finally, he looked at Lucy, and there his voice grew lower. Not to perform pain, but because true pain is sometimes ashamed of taking up space. "I turned you into part of a test that never should have existed," Adrian said, holding the cloth without extending it yet. "Because even returning something can be an invasion if one doesn't wait for permission. You told me who you were, with every dish, every gesture, and every boundary. And I kept hiding who I was, because I liked too much the way you looked at me, without my last name. That was selfish. I didn't lie because you were interested in money. I lied because I was afraid. And that fear doesn't justify putting you in a relationship where I knew everything and you couldn't decide with the whole truth." The kitchen fell silent. Rose lowered the flame under the pot. Tommy stopped pretending to read, and Lucy looked at him as if every word had to pass through a wound before reaching anywhere useful. She didn't cry. Adrian was glad she didn't cry for him, because he hadn't come looking for tears that would let him feel forgiven. Lucy asked him what he had done at the company, and he answered with facts, not promises. The official credit for the recipe belonged to Rose and Lucy Harper. Stephen was gone. The prep cooks would have their promotions reviewed, and no image of her would be used without authorization. "That's good," Lucy said after a pause, and her voice was firm, almost too calm. "But it doesn't give me back the night I thought I had invited a wounded man into my home and discovered I had let my boss into my kitchen." Adrian lowered his gaze, taking the blow without shielding himself. She took the cloth from his hands, looked at it a moment, and set it on the table, still without putting it over her shoulder. Then she told him that if they were ever going to start over, it would have to be from zero, with his true name, without big gifts, without decisions made for her, and without using money to cover the damage the way someone lays a clean tablecloth over a broken table. Adrian said yes, and that word didn't sound victorious, but small. Rose, who until then had kept silent, pointed at a chair and said that a man who asks forgiveness on an empty stomach tends to get dramatic, so he'd better sit down before he ruined dinner. Tommy protested that maybe it was too soon to feed him, but the grandmother answered that giving someone food was not absolving him. It was reminding him that he was still human and therefore had an obligation to behave like one. Lucy didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth trembled just barely. And Adrian took a seat with the care of someone who knows a chair is not a right, but an opportunity. The soup appeared at the center of the table, this time in an ordinary pot, without white porcelain or event lighting. The blue corn had the deep color of the first night. The epazote perfumed the air, and the tortillas waited wrapped in a clean cloth. Adrian didn't talk much during dinner. He washed the dishes afterward, burning his fingers a little, and Tommy gave him a grade of 6.5, which according to him was failing in romance but a miracle pass in dishwashing. Lucy let out a brief laugh, and though it was not complete forgiveness, it was the first sound that didn't come wrapped in distance. The following months were not a perfect postcard, because honest wounds do not close at the pace of an advertising campaign. Lucy did not return to Sterling table as a prep cook. She accepted, after reviewing every clause with her own lawyer paid by herself, the direction of a small community cooking workshop financed with transparent company funds, where young people from the neighborhood learned technique, costs, and professional dignity. On the wall, a simple plaque read, "Original recipe by Rose Harper and Lucy Harper." And below, written in marker by Tommy, was an informal warning. Stealing soups, ideas, or hearts is prohibited. Adrian arrived late some afternoons, not as an owner, but as a clumsy volunteer who chopped onions with excessive concentration and took orders from Rose without arguing. Lucy allowed him to walk nearby, then to sit at the table, then to accompany her to the market, and much later, when trust stopped feeling like a taut rope, she allowed him to take her hand in front of a boiling pot. There was no magic instant in which everything was forgotten. There was something better. Many small days in which Adrian chose to tell the truth even when it didn't favor him, and Lucy chose to believe him only when his actions no longer asked her to hurry. The night they officially inaugurated the workshop, Tommy hung a new version of his drawing at the entrance. Rose stood next to the pot. Lucy wore an enormous chef's hat. He held his spoon like a sword, and Adrian appeared in the background washing dishes with a face of heroic concentration. This time, beneath the figure, Tommy wrote, "Adrian, formerly Matthew, currently on probation." And everyone laughed with that kind of laughter that doesn't erase the past but makes it bearable. Adrian looked at Lucy, and she settled the cloth with the R over his shoulder, like someone granting not absolution, but carefully tended trust. Much later, when the workshop lights went out and only the smell of the soup remained floating in the street, Adrian understood that he had not bought a home, or conquered a forgiveness, or recovered what was lost with a brilliant strategy. He had received it, little by little, through washed dishes, truths told on time, boundaries respected, and a table where nobody needed to pretend in order to be loved. And when Lucy rested her head on his shoulder while Rose closed the door and Tommy argued with a rebellious bag of tortillas, Adrian finally knew that some riches are not possessed. They are deserved, cared for, and given thanks for, in silence. If this story made you smile, feel moved, or believe a little more in second chances, leave in the comments which city or country you're listening from, so this warm table can reach more people who also need a simple hope. The first Sunday, Adrian Sterling arrived late to the community cooking workshop. Tommy would not let him in until he explained his tardiness in front of everyone present, because according to him, punctuality was part of the rehabilitation process for dramatic millionaires. Adrian stood at the door with a bag of fresh ears of corn in one hand, a box of lemons in the other, and an expression so guilty that 3 teenagers from the workshop started laughing before he said a single word. Lucy, from the central table, pretended to review an ingredient list so as not to smile too soon, though the shine in her eyes betrayed her with that discreet sweetness he was still learning to receive without wanting to possess it. The reason for the delay was simple, and for Adrian deeply humiliating. He had gone to the market alone, without an assistant, without a driver, and without sending an emergency message to Lucy every time a woman offered him 3 types of corn with intimidating confidence. He had bought the wrong ears at first. Then Rose corrected him by phone with a venomous patience. And in the end, he wound up carrying 2 more bags than necessary because a boy at the stall told him those lemons would be sad if they were left alone. Tommy declared that this explanation was acceptable, though he suspected emotional manipulation on the part of the child vendor, and assigned him as punishment to chop onions without complaining. The workshop operated in a small space, 4 blocks from Lucy's old building, with walls painted soft yellow, metal shelves, long wooden tables, and a handmade sign saying that nobody entered there to be saved, but to learn to stand on their own. Lucy had written that phrase after rejecting, for the 3rd time, a company proposal to turn the place into an image campaign that was far too pretty. Adrian had learned not to insist. Some victories of his new life consisted precisely in closing his mouth before transforming a good intention into a golden cage. Lucy ran the workshop with a warm authority that sometimes frightened more than any shout. She taught how to calculate costs, how to wash knives without getting distracted, how to respect someone else's recipe, and how not to apologize for cooking from the neighborhood, from memory, or from a kitchen without expensive appliances. Rose occupied a chair near the window, and from there she governed the world with a wooden spoon, correcting the salt, the posture, the excess confidence, and, when necessary, Adrian's masculine ego. Tommy, for his part, had appointed himself Inspector of Culinary Dignity, a position without salary, but with many opinions. That afternoon they were preparing blue corn soup for an open neighborhood dinner, and Lucy had decided that the young people from the workshop would be the ones to explain the recipe to the visitors. She didn't want the story to become a charity tale or a romantic legend about a poor cook discovered by a rich man. She wanted everyone to understand something simpler and more difficult. A recipe survives because many hands care for it, and no hand is worth less for coming from a small kitchen. Adrian heard her say that while chopping onions with watering eyes, and Tommy, who never missed an opportunity, asked him whether he was crying from emotion or from technical incompetence. Adrian answered that both things could coexist, and the laughter that burst around the table made him feel clumsy, exposed, and strangely happy. Months earlier, a joke like that would have struck some proud fiber of his character. Now it seemed a privilege. Being the object of jokes in that kitchen meant they no longer treated him like a dangerous statue. They treated him like someone who could make mistakes, correct himself, and remain there. For a man who had spent half his life surrounded by people impeccable out of obligation, that humble freedom tasted like a slow absolution. When dinner time arrived, the space filled with neighbors, children, tired mothers, curious old men, and some workers from the old Sterling table kitchen who had entered the internal training program. Nobody wore a suit, except one young journalist who didn't understand the instruction to come comfortable and ended up sweating dignity in a blue blazer. Lucy allowed a brief interview only because the questions had been sent in advance, and because the outlet agreed not to turn her story into a rescue tale. She talked about work, about fair credit, about family, and about the need for companies to learn to see the people who hold up their kitchens from below. Adrian stayed at the back, serving water, collecting plates, and avoiding the center of any photograph. Before, he would have believed that disappearing from an important scene was wasting power. Now he understood that sometimes loving meant stepping one pace back so the right person could occupy the light. Lucy looked at him from the table where she was explaining the recipe, and he tilted his head just slightly, not as an owner, not as a sponsor, but as someone saying without words, "This moment is yours, and I'm not going to touch it." She held his gaze for a second, then continued speaking with a confidence that filled his chest with quiet pride. At the end of the night, when the visitors had gone and the pots stood empty, Tommy found Adrian washing ladles alongside two workshop students and announced that the general level of cleanliness had improved by 8%. Adrian asked whether that meant he was finally approved, but Tommy shook his head gravely and said that in family matters evaluations were continuous, unannounced, and immune to bribery. Rose added from her chair that this was true, though it was also true that Adrian now knew how to dry dishes without leaving them dripping, which in certain men should be considered spiritual progress. Lucy laughed then, open and clear, and the sound filled the space more than any music. Later, when only the four of them remained, Rose asked them to sit down before putting away the last pot. She took from her bag the cloth embroidered with the R, the same one that had wrapped the first soup in front of the golden door, and placed it on the table with a solemnity that extinguished Tommy's jokes. She said a family is not formed because everything was perfect, but because someone stays to repair what they broke, and someone else decides, without obligation, to open a crack. Then she looked at Adrian with those eyes that always seemed to have known him before knowing him, and told him not to confuse being forgiven with being finished caring. Adrian nodded with a tight throat and answered that he didn't want to finish caring, that he wanted to learn to do it every day. He promised no grandeur, spoke of no houses, trips, or futures wrapped in shiny paper. He said he wanted to be there in the market mornings, in the workshop's accounts, on the days when Lucy was tired and didn't want to be anyone's inspiration, in the afternoons, when Tommy needed help even while pretending he didn't, and in Rose's silences, when memory brought her old sorrows. Lucy listened without taking her eyes off him, and this time there was no fear in her gaze, only the loving prudence of someone who knows how much it costs to trust again. Then Tommy, incapable of enduring too much emotion without defending himself with humor, asked whether that was a formal family proposal or an application for a professional internship. Rose gave him a soft tap with the wooden spoon. Lucy lowered her head to hide her smile, and Adrian, braver than elegant, answered that if the Harper family accepted applications, he was willing to start from the lowest position. Tommy pretended to think it over, asked for references, a dishwashing record, and an unsupervised soup test, but in the end, he extended his hand with an exaggerated seriousness that made Lucy laugh until her eyes grew damp. That night, closing the workshop, Lucy and Adrian walked together beneath the stalls that were already turning off their lights along the street. They didn't hold hands at first. She carried the keys, he carried a bag of clean rags, and between them, there was a calm that needed no grand demonstrations. At the corner, Lucy stopped in front of the reflection in a closed shop window and saw their two figures side by side, he without a suit, she without a restaurant uniform, both a little tired, smelling of corn, smoke, and soap. She thought of the first time she had seen him sitting on the ground, and it hurt less, not because the lie had disappeared, but because the truth had worked hard since then. Adrian seemed to understand the journey of her thoughts and didn't interrupt her. He waited, as he had learned to wait, and when she finally interlaced her fingers with his, she did it without theatricality, almost like someone setting a pot on the right flame. He didn't squeeze her hand too hard, only held it with care, remembering that love was not a property or a reward, but a warm trust that could grow cold if one stopped tending it. Lucy rested her head on his shoulder for a moment and murmured that he still needed to learn to choose good ears of corn, but that maybe, under strict supervision, he had a future. Adrian laughed softly, and for the first time he felt no need to answer with something perfect. The workshop stayed behind with its yellow lights. The city kept moving with its usual noise, and somewhere nearby, Tommy was arguing with Rose because he wanted to name the next course Soups Against Reformed Liars. Lucy said that name was horrible. Rose answered that this was exactly why it would be unforgettable. And Adrian walked between them with the bag of rags in one hand, and the other joined with Lucy's, knowing he had arrived at the only luxury that couldn't be bought, being awaited, without a mask, at a table where the truth also had a chair. This story educates and entertains by showing that trust cannot be built on a false identity, even when the lie is born of fear and not of malice. Through Adrian and Lucy, the narrative speaks of self-worth, truth in love, responsibility after a mistake, the value of family, respect for emotional boundaries, and the certainty that money cannot buy forgiveness. Adrian only begins to change when he stops using his power as a shortcut and learns to repair with real actions, accepting consequences without demanding that Lucy heal at the pace of his remorse. It is also a story of romantic entertainment designed to embrace the listener with warmth, humor, and emotion. The difference in class creates tender and comic moments. Everyday life makes the falling in love believable. The kitchen works as a symbol of memory and belonging, and the public revelation of Adrian's identity delivers a strong but intimate pain, without turning Lucy into a voiceless victim. The happy ending does not erase the wound, but transforms it into a path of care, truth, and chosen family, where love is proven by staying, listening, and learning to come home.